The night shift at Seattle General in San Antonio moves like a held breath, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer, monitors beeping in steady rhythm, and Sarah Chen moving through it all with the kind of invisibility that only comes from practice. She is a ghost in scrubs, her badge clipped to her waist, her hand steady as she checks the vitals on the Marine in bed 7. Lance Corporal Marcus Webb. The chart reads: Medic. Helmand Province. She doesn't pause when she reads it, though something in her chest tightens, a muscle memory of heat and dust and the particular weight of someone else's life in your hands. The full line runs clear. Oxygen saturation 94%. His chest wound is wrapped tight, gauze already beginning to stain with serosanguineous fluid. She documents everything on her tablet with the precision of someone who has learned that careful work is the only work that matters. Her fingers move across the screen, and for a moment she allows herself to look at his face. Eyes closed. Young. 23, maybe 24. The age she was when she first learned that combat medicine is about triage, about choosing who lives and who doesn't, about moving forward even when your hands want to shake. They don't shake. Not here. Not now. In her locker downstairs, in the small paper bag she keeps behind her work shoes, there is a faded unit patch. Olive drab with worn edges, the kind of thing you sew into the lining of a jacket before a deployment you're not supposed to talk about. She touched it this morning before her shift, a ritual older than she wants to admit. 17 seconds, her palm flat against the fabric. Just long enough to remember. Just long enough to feel the weight of names. 3 of them dead. All of them ghosts she was ordered to forget. Captain Sarah Chen. That's who she was. That's who she isn't anymore. The fluorescent lights flicker. A small electrical surge that makes the monitor screen jump for a fraction of a second. Sarah's eyes track it automatically, assessing, calculating. Old habits. Her breath is even. Her pulse hasn't moved. She reaches for the saline flush to maintain the peripheral for line, and that's when the doorway darkens. Dr. Pierce stands there like something that shouldn't exist in a hospital, like contempt given a lab coat and a name badge. His eyes move across Sarah's work with the intensity of a man cataloging ammunition. He's been watching her for 3 weeks now, since she started the night shift rotation in trauma and critical care. She knows his pattern. Observes her. Then finds something wrong. Then speaks about her inadequacy as though she isn't in the room, as though the presence of a Marine's weeping mother makes her somehow transparent. Ms. Chen, he says. The way he says her name makes it clear this isn't a greeting. It's an indictment. His voice carries that particular theatrical concern, the kind that doctors use when they want an audience to know they're the only competent adult in the room. I've been reviewing your documentation on Corporal Webb's wound care. Sarah's hands keep moving. She doesn't turn. The tape on Webb's for needs adjusting, just slightly, to prevent kinking. Her fingers attend to it with the same steadiness she would use on a runway under fire. Your notes are missing the circumferential assessment, Pierce continues, stepping into the room as though he's inherited it. His voice rises just enough that Mrs. Webb, sitting in the chair beside the bed with tissues balled in her fist, looks up with the desperate hope that someone here actually knows what they're doing. Substandard documentation creates liability. It endangers our heroes. The word heroes lands hard. Sarah's jaw tightens. Just fractionally. Just enough that if someone was watching very carefully, they might see the smallest clench of muscle at her temple. She turns to face him, tablet in hand, and nods once. I'll add the circumferential assessment, she says quietly. 9 words. Not apologetic. Not defensive. Just a statement of fact. Her voice is lower than most people remember it being, and there's no inflection in it at all, which seems to frustrate Pierce more than if she'd argued. See that you do, he says, and then he's looking at Mrs. Webb with a smile that doesn't touch his eyes. Your son is in excellent hands. Though documentation like this makes one wonder about the quality of care. The smile lingers. Sarah's hands move across her tablet, adding the assessment he requested, her touch against the screen light and precise. The supply closet is 3 doors down. She can feel the temperature of the room changing, the particular weight of an unsaid argument pressing against her sternum. Pierce leaves. His footsteps are deliberate, the kind of footsteps a man makes when he wants people to know he's been somewhere important. Sarah finishes her charting and tells Mrs. Webb that she'll be back to check vitals in 30 minutes. The woman nods, exhausted, grateful for someone who actually looks at her son instead of through him. Sarah steps into the hallway and walks past the supply closet door twice before she pushes it open. The space is small and fluorescent lit, lined with bandages and saline drips and oxygen masks still in their plastic packaging. She closes the door behind her and allows herself 3 minutes. That's all. 3 minutes to stand in the chemical smell of antiseptic and let the tremor move through her hands. It's not fear. Fear is something she hasn't felt in 2 years, not since the extraction went sideways in Sanjin Valley and the order came through to disappear. The tremor is something else, a kind of pressure release, the way a vessel holds hydraulic fluid and sometimes the pressure just needs somewhere to go. She watches her fingers shake and waits for them to still. They do. By the time she pushes back out into the hallway, her hands are steady again. By the time she reaches the break room, she's the ghost again. The other nurses are gathered around the coffee station, their movements synchronized like schooling fish. There's Jessica with her lunch container, Marcus with the thermos he brings from home, Patricia with her phone already pulled out for her break time scrolling. Sarah pushes through the door and the change in air pressure is immediate. The synchronized movement breaks. Jessica's lunch container is suddenly very important. Marcus's thermos needs resealing. Patricia finds something fascinating on her phone screen that absolutely requires her attention. They don't leave all at once, that would be too obvious, but within 45 seconds, the room is empty except for Sarah and the hum of the refrigerator and the particular kind of silence that happens when people have made a deliberate choice to exclude someone. She sits. Her coffee is in the mug with the faded Marine Corps emblem, the one she uses every shift because the alternative is drinking from the communal cups and accepting the implicit forgiveness that would come with pretending to be one of them. She won't do that. She doesn't do apologies she hasn't made. The bulletin board is directly in her line of sight. That's when she sees it, the third one. A piece of white paper, printed in the clinical font of hospital administration, pinned at an angle that suggests Pierce didn't actually put it there himself but had one of his allies do it. The handwriting on the signature line is his though, neat and architectural, the signature of someone who has paid good money to learn how to sign like they own things. Employee, Sarah Chen. Date, the 28th of November, 2024. Incident, failure to demonstrate team cohesion during departmental rounds. Supervisor assessment, pattern of isolation, resistance to collaborative approaches, inability to prioritize group dynamics. She reads it twice. The mug stays in her hand, steady and warm. The coffee inside has gone slightly cool, a film forming on the surface that means she's been sitting here longer than she realized. She doesn't pull the notice down. Doesn't read it again. Doesn't give the room or Pierce or any of the circling nurses the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she finishes her coffee slowly and methodically, looking at nothing in particular, and then she stands and walks back to the station. The night stretches ahead. 3 more hours until midnight. 4 hours after that until the shift change. Webb is sleeping now, or close to it, he's breathing deep and steady through the oxygen mask. She checks his line again, confirms the monitors are still tracking, and sits in the chair beside his mother. Mrs. Webb is asleep too, her head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, her hand still extended toward her son's arm though she's not quite touching him. Trauma waiting rooms are full of these small separations, the distance that fear creates, the way people who love each other most can sometimes barely reach across the space between them. Sarah pulls the blanket from the foot of the bed and drapes it over Mrs. Webb's shoulders. The woman doesn't wake. In the hallway, someone pages for a respiratory tech. In the distance, a siren approaches Seattle General, then passes, heading somewhere else. The night is full of these sounds, these small crises and interventions happening in parallel across the city. Sarah has learned to exist in the spaces between them, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who has made herself necessary without making herself known. But what she hasn't learned, what she's been deliberately refusing to consider, is that invisibility has an expiration date. Pierce is testing her now, escalating. And in exactly 48 hours, that testing is going to stop. The monitor screamed at 2:36 a.m. A single sustained wail that cut through the quiet of the night shift like a blade. Sarah's head snapped up from the medication cart at the nurse's station, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that sickly institutional yellow, and she was moving before her brain caught up, muscle memory, the kind that doesn't forget even when you're trying to disappear into a new life. Webb's room. Second door on the left, the one where she'd checked his vitals 6 hours ago and found him stable, breathing easy, the worst of the crisis supposedly behind him. Not anymore. The monitor display screamed its warning, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, heart rate climbing past 140, blood pressure collapsing toward a number that meant minutes, maybe less. She pushed through the door to find Webb grey-lipped and gasping, his mouth working like a fish pulled from water, his eyes wide and terrified. His head tilted to the left, his neck muscles straining against the effort of trying to pull air into lungs that wouldn't cooperate. The chart said tension pneumothorax. The clinical data said his chest wound, the one from the IED that had almost killed him before he even made it to the operating room, had reopened internally, air escaping from his lung tissue into his chest cavity, collapsing the lung and pushing his heart sideways, cutting off every pathway his body had for drawing breath. The resident, Dr. Huang, stood frozen 3 feet from the bed, his phone halfway to his ear, trembling. Useless. Good instinct to call for backup, but he'd be waiting, and Webb would be dead. Sarah didn't hesitate. Didn't second guess. Didn't check with anyone for permission. She moved to the crash cart, her hands already reaching for what she needed, the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the one used for emergency decompression, the kind of procedure that required explicit orders and documentation and probably a surgeon standing over your shoulder. She had none of those things. She had seconds. Get me O2 running. Her voice was steady, cold, a thread of steel through the chaos. Webb's mother, who'd been sleeping in the recliner beside the bed, jolted awake with a gasp. Sarah didn't look at her. 10 liters, non-rebreather. Now. She swabbed Webb's chest with alcohol, the sharp medicinal smell cutting through the recycled hospital air. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomy was the same whether you were in a trauma bay at Brooke Army or in a combat casualty aid station outside Jalalabad with rounds snapping past your head. The needle caught slightly as she drove it through the skin, through the fascia, the resistance gone suddenly as the needle breached the pleural space. The hiss of air escaping was like the last breath of something dying, pressure equalizing, physics asserting itself. The sound lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then silence. Then Webb's body sagged backward into the mattress, his mouth opening, his lungs finally filling. She didn't remove the needle. Didn't step back. Didn't acknowledge the mother's strangled sob or Webb's desperate gasping as his oxygen saturation began climbing, 75 on the monitor, then 82, then 88, then holding steady in the mid-90s where it belonged. His color returned like someone had switched on a light inside him, the gray receding from his lips, his eyes losing that wild animal panic. Angiocath catheter secured, Sarah said quietly to Dr. Huang, who was still holding his phone. Notify surgery. He's going to need a chest tube. She was already moving to the monitors, already charting with the clinical precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, her hands moving across the tablet screen with the fluidity of long practice, documenting exactly what she'd seen, what she'd done, what had changed. Procedure, time, result. Just facts. Just a nurse doing her job. Webb's mother reached for Sarah's arm, tears streaming down her face. You saved him. Oh God, you saved him. Sarah gently extracted herself, already turning away, already becoming invisible again. The surgical team will take it from here. She made it to the hallway before she let herself acknowledge that her heart was still pounding like a percussion instrument gone haywire. That was when Dr. Pierce arrived. He appeared at the end of the corridor like something summoned by dark intention itself, his scrubs pristine, his hair perfectly styled even at this hour, his expression carrying that particular coldness he reserved for moments when he sensed weakness in the system. He took in the scene with his eyes, the open door to Webb's room, the mother's tears visible from the hallway, the monitors still beeping their steady rhythm, and his mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could contain teeth like that. "What exactly happened here, Nurse Chen?" His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. The kind of pleasant that came from a man standing in a hallway knowing he held all the cards. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Tension pneumothorax. Chest wound dehiscence. The resident ordered emergency needle decompression. She didn't inflect it as a question. Didn't defend. Didn't explain. Just stated the facts and watched his expression shift as he processed the implication. Behind her, Dr. Huang made a small sound, something between assent and panic. He was young, still learning the architecture of institutional power, still terrified of getting things wrong. He would be easy to turn if Pierce wanted him turned. But Pierce wasn't looking at Huang. Pierce was looking at Sarah, and in that moment, his smile went crystalline. "I see," he said, and the words carried the weight of a man who'd just found the thread that would unravel everything. "That's quite outside your scope of practice, isn't it?" "The patient was dying," Sarah said simply. "Scope doesn't matter when there's no other choice." Pierce stepped into Webb's room, glancing at the monitor, at the angiocath needle still in place, at Webb's mother hovering over her son like a guardian angel finally allowed to stop fighting. He looked at the data and understood immediately that Sarah had just saved a life, the kind of save that would normally result in commendation, professional recognition, maybe a memo in her file about quick thinking under pressure. Instead, he nodded slowly and stepped back into the hallway where Sarah was waiting. "For minutes," he said. That's how long it took for the surgical team to arrive once the resident called. "You're aware that performing a procedure outside your certification scope violates Texas Nursing Board regulations, regardless of the circumstances?" He wasn't asking. He was already pulling his phone from his pocket, his thumb already moving toward the screen. "Regardless of the outcome, I'm afraid. The rules exist for a reason, Nurse Chen." He walked toward the nursing station without waiting for an answer. Sarah watched him go, her expression unchanged, her pulse steady as a metronome. She knew the game now. Had known it since he'd first started making those subtle comments about her credentials, her judgment, her place on his team. This was checkmate coming into view, the final move in a larger strategy she was only now beginning to understand. Pierce sat at the station, pulled up the contact information he'd clearly been waiting to use, and made his first call. "Hello, Daniel." "Yes, I know it's early. We need to talk about that referral commission you mentioned." His voice was smooth as oil on still water. He was sitting 3 feet from Sarah, making no effort to lower his voice, performing this for an audience of one. She continued her charting, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "I have a personnel matter that requires board intervention. Someone here is exceeding her scope of practice in dangerous ways. I'll need your vote when this comes to the disciplinary committee." "Yes, the Chen problem I mentioned." "Excellent. We'll make this official by end of business." He disconnected and dialed again. The call connected immediately, no ringing, suggesting a saved contact in his phone. Texas Nursing Board, Licensing Division. His voice shifted, became deferential in a way that was somehow worse than his arrogance. "I'm Dr. Aaron Pierce, Chief of Surgery at Seattle General in San Antonio. I need to file a formal complaint about one of our nurses performing a procedure outside her scope of practice this morning. Code blue situation, she didn't wait for physician authorization." "Yes, I'm a witness. The procedure was successful, but that's not really the point, is it? The regulations exist regardless of outcome." "Yes, I can provide documentation." Sarah didn't look at him. She finished her charting, submitted it to the system with a click that sounded very loud, and moved toward the medication refrigerator. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. The trembling, when it came, would wait until she was alone. Pierce ended the call and dialed a third time. This one connected to voicemail, which he left a message on. "This is Dr. Aaron Pierce. I have a personnel investigation I need you to handle immediately. Nurse Sarah Chen at Seattle General, San Antonio. I need background verification, any criminal history, any complaints from previous employers. I suspect we're dealing with someone who's misrepresented her credentials. Call me when you have preliminary findings. Priority is important. This is urgent." He hung up and finally looked at Sarah, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd just set 3 different mechanisms in motion and knew that at least one of them would work. "You should know," he said quietly, "that I take the protection of my patients very seriously. Regardless of how sympathetic the circumstances might be, regulations exist to prevent dangerous people from practicing medicine." He stood, checked his watch, for 02 a.m., and nodded to himself as though confirming something he'd already calculated. "You're doing excellent work tonight, by the way. Really exemplary. I'm glad we're both committed to the highest standards." He left the nursing station as silently as he'd appeared, leaving Sarah alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of Webb's heart monitor, steady and strong and alive because she'd made a choice that everything about her training and experience had told her was right, and everything about institutional power was about to tell her was wrong. The break room clock showed 4:04 a.m. In exactly 48 hours, that phone call would come. The one she wasn't supposed to expect. The one that would change everything, though she couldn't possibly know that yet, standing alone in a hospital at the edge of dawn, her hand steady and her future collapsing in 3 different directions at once. By noon, Sarah sat across from the administrator in a chair that had been deliberately chosen to be lower than his. She could see the calculation in it, the way the desk angle forced her to look slightly upward, the way the windows behind him created a silhouette effect that rendered his face unreadable. Dr. Pierce stood near the doorway, his arms crossed with the satisfaction of a man who had finally cornered something he could destroy. The administrator, his nameplate read M. Holloway, administrator, opened a folder with practice sympathy. His voice carried the texture of regret, the kind practiced in HR seminars. "Captain Chen, we've received documentation regarding several scope of practice violations. Specifically, the emergency needle decompression performed without physician authorization at 2:22 a.m. on Lance Corporal Webb." Sarah didn't move. Didn't blink. Her hands remained flat on the desk. "Additionally," Holloway continued, "we've initiated a review of your nursing credentials with the Texas Board. It's standard procedure when scope violations occur." Standard procedure. He repeated it as though the repetition might soften what came next. "We're placing you on immediate suspension, pending investigation. Full pay during the review period, of course." Of course. As though money mattered. As though the problem was financial. Pierce stepped forward. His voice held that particular cruelty that came from absolute certainty. "We've also contacted your previous employers for credential verification. St. Catherine's in Seattle, Mount Sinai in Chicago, both confirmed your employment, though interestingly, both had remarkably sparse documentation." Sparse. Your personnel files seem to have significant gaps. That was the hammer. Not the emergency procedure. Any halfway competent nurse with a heartbeat would have done the same thing. The hammer was the gaps in the records. The redacted sections. The places where classified military service simply stopped existing, scrubbed clean by people whose job was making people disappear. Sarah's jaw tightened. Fractional. Controlled. A tremor would have been weakness. A word would have been panic. Silence was armor. "We'll need your hospital badge and access key card," Holloway said gently, as though asking for her house keys, her car, her identity. "A security escort will accompany you to your locker to collect your personal items." Hospital policy. Sarah reached down. Unclipped the badge from her scrubs. The ID photo showed a woman with dead eyes and no rank, no unit, no history, a ghost wearing a name that wasn't entirely hers. She slid it across the desk. The plastic made a soft scraping sound against the polished wood. The access card followed. the one that had let her into the supply closet at 3 a.m. when she needed to cry, where no one could see, where the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects and the antiseptic smell could bleach away the memory of Helmand for a few minutes. Where she could press her palms against the metal shelving and remember that she had survived worse than this. "We'll be in touch," Pierce said. Not a threat. A promise. The security escort was efficient, professional, impersonal, which was worse than cruelty because it meant this happened regularly, that the hospital had a protocol for erasing people. Sarah walked beside him through corridors she'd memorized over 18 months, past nursing stations where other staff suddenly became very interested in their computers. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm. Somewhere down a side corridor, a monitor beeped its steady pulse. The smell of bleach and human suffering hung in the air like a permanent stain. Her locker was small. Everything fit in a cardboard box that had been used for 4 fluid shipments. The cracked mug from the break room, Marine Corps emblem faded to almost nothing, went in first. The dying succulent she'd been trying to save for 3 weeks, its leaves curled and brown despite every attempt at resurrection, came next. And finally, the photo. 8 Marines in desert gear, dust-covered and exhausted, taken in the compound at FOB Shank outside Lashkar Gah. She knew every face. Knew the 3 who weren't coming home. Knew the 5 others who'd made it stateside only to find their own versions of civilian erasure, jobs that wouldn't hire them, marriages that couldn't survive the silence, bodies that couldn't sleep without the sound of rotor wash. She folded the jacket carefully, the one with the unit patch sewn inside the lining. The patch that no one was supposed to know about. The patch made from aircraft wreckage and the emblem of a unit that officially never existed. She placed it on top of the photo. The security guard waited by the exit with the patience of someone who'd done this before, many times, to many people who'd outlived their usefulness. At 1:03 p.m., Sarah stood at a bus stop on Roosevelt Avenue with the cardboard box going soft in her arms. Rain hammered the metal shelter like artillery on a tin roof. The schedule posted behind plexiglass promised a bus at 1:15. The schedule was a lie. At 1:43, she was still standing there, rain soaking through her scrubs, the box beginning to disintegrate around the edges. A car passed. Headlights. The sound of wet tires on asphalt. No one stopped. No one ever did. She realized then, with the clarity that comes from 18 months of living as a ghost, that she had nowhere to go. Every apartment she could rent required an ID, a social security number, a paper trail that would trigger the very protocols her commanding officer had warned against. Every person she could call was erased from the same record she was, 3 dead names, 5 others scattered across the country with standing orders to maintain distance. The unit was gone. Her team was gone. The only person who knew she existed was currently making phone calls that would end careers. She sat on the bench, the cardboard box dissolving in her lap, and waited. The rain didn't stop. The bus never came. What came instead was 48 hours in a cash-only motel on the edge of San Antonio where no ID was required, just money, just silence. A room with walls that smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. A bed with scratchy sheets. A television that played news she couldn't absorb because every story felt like it was about someone else, someone with a future, someone whose record hadn't been erased by people in offices making decisions about who got to exist and who got to disappear. Her phone buzzed at 3 a.m. on the first night. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It buzzed again at 7 a.m., again at noon. She let each call ring to silence. On the second night, at 11:16 p.m., her phone rang again. Different. Official. The area code made her hand go still. 703, Pentagon area code. Number she hadn't heard in 2 years, not since the call that had sent her into civilian life, into scrubs instead of BDUs, into a hospital where she was invisible and it was supposed to stay that way. She stared at the phone. Rain hammered the motel window. The parking lot outside was empty, just marked spaces and darkness and a neon sign that buzzed like dying insects. The phone rang again. She picked up. The voice on the other end didn't identify itself. Just said 4 words, "General Mercer needs you." Exactly 48 hours after her suspension began, Sarah's phone rang with a Pentagon area code. She didn't recognize the number. Let it ring once, twice, watching it from the window of a cash-only motel on the edge of San Antonio where nobody asked questions and the rooms rented by the hour. The voice on the other end was male, clipped, military precise. "Captain Chen, return to Seattle General immediately. Room 7. This is not a request." The line went dead. She didn't pack anything. Her cardboard box was still in the motel closet, the cracked mug, the dying succulent, the photograph. She left them there. Walked out into afternoon heat that hammered down like a physical force, caught a cab using cash from the envelope of severance pay she'd never actually opened, and gave the driver the hospital address without explanation. Her hands were steady. Her breathing controlled. The composure that had kept her alive for 3 tours held firm now, muscle memory in her nervous system, the ability to compartmentalize shock into actionable steps. Security at Seattle General's entrance shifted when they saw her. One of them reached for his radio, then hesitated, receiving some kind of silent signal through his earpiece. They waved her through without checking her ID. Past them, down the corridor she'd walked 1,000 times, past the break room where the other nurses had stopped eating lunch when she arrived, past the supply closet where she'd washed her trembling hands after Dr. Pierce's public humiliation. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hymn overhead, a sound she usually didn't notice, but now it seemed to thrum through her skull like a warning. Webb's room was crowded when she reached it. She knew immediately something fundamental had shifted. The Marines were everywhere, 3 of them in dress blues, their uniforms crisp as fresh-cut glass, their bearing the particular stillness of men trained to stand at attention without moving. At the center of the room stood a 2-star general she'd never met. His presence occupied space like a gravitational field, like the air pressure changed when he breathed. He was 70-something, with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of a winter sky, and when he turned his head toward her, everyone in the room recognized it as a command. Webb's eyes were open. Focused. For the first time in 48 hours, they held recognition. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. The general stepped aside slightly, giving Sarah a clear line of sight to the bed. Webb's voice came out as a whisper, cracked and hoarse from the ventilator tube they'd finally removed, but it carried across the entire room with absolute clarity, "Valkyrie." The room went dead silent. The sound of the heart monitor suddenly audible, beeping in steady, perfect rhythm. His mother looked between Sarah and her son, confusion flickering across her face. Sarah felt her composure shift, just barely. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Nothing else moved. That half-inch was everything. A staff captain stepped forward from the cluster of Marines, holding a document that had clearly been handled many times. His voice was formal, precise, the kind of voice that read citations in front of crowds. "Captain Sarah Chen, United States Marine Corps." He paused, letting the rank settle into the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Silver Star for Valor under fire, Helmand Province, for holding a defensive position for 11 hours while extracting wounded." The captain looked directly at her. "Despite sustained enemy contact and personal injury, you maintained your position to ensure every member of your unit reached the landing zone. Your actions saved lives." That was when Dr. Pierce's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Sarah heard them before anyone else did, the precise click of expensive leather shoes on tile, the sound of a man walking with purpose. He'd been monitoring her entry through security cameras, monitoring Webb's room status, waiting for the moment when she crossed some bureaucratic line he could use against her. She could read his calculation in the rhythm of his footsteps. He shouldered through the doorway with his face flushed, vindication painted across his features like war paint. "This woman is trespassing in a secure medical facility. She has fraudulent credentials and is," he held up a folder. "I have documentation of her illegal practice, unlicensed clinical decisions, practicing beyond her scope. I've called hospital security and the nursing board. She needs to be removed immediately." The general turned slowly. His movement had weight to it, not rushed, not theatrical, but absolute. His expression was carved from ice. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone had to lean forward to hear it, which made it somehow more lethal than a shout could ever be. "Doctor, you initiated an investigation into a classified operative. That investigation triggered automatic Pentagon review protocols." Pierce faltered. His jaw tightened. "I don't understand." "We understand perfectly," the general continued. Two MPs stepped into the doorway behind Pierce. She didn't see them arrive, they were simply suddenly there, like they'd materialized from the walls. "In the past 48 hours, we have examined every case you have touched. Every chart you have signed. Every billing code you have submitted. Every pharmaceutical representative you have met within the past 3 years." The color drained from Pierce's face like someone had pulled a plug. The staff captain resumed reading, his voice cutting through the moment. "Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb, injured during medical evacuation operations, survived due to direct actions of his commanding officer. Captain Sarah Chen was the sole operator maintaining defensive position while Lance Corporal Webb and 2 other wounded Marines were evacuated by medevac." He turned slightly toward Webb. "Webb, you want to add anything?" Webb's voice was stronger now, as if he'd been waiting for permission to speak. "She carried me 2 kilometers to the landing zone. Took fire the whole way. Shrapnel in her shoulder. Didn't even slow down." Sarah's hands remained steady. Her breathing steady. But something in her chest was cracking open, not breaking, not shattering, just cracking along seams she'd been holding together since Helmand Province, since the night everything was erased. The general reached into an evidence bag one of the Marines was holding and withdrew a faded unit patch. The fabric was worn, the embroidery barely visible, but there was dried blood on the corner, rust-colored stains that had never fully washed out. "This was found in your locker 3 hours ago, Captain. Sewn inside your jacket lining. Marked with Lance Corporal Webb's blood from the night of extraction." Sarah's composure didn't crack. But her eyes did something, a shift, a recognition, like looking at a photograph of herself from another lifetime. Pierce tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "This is absurd. She's a nurse with basic credentials. If she's some kind of military operative, she's practicing medicine under false pretenses." A Marine colonel stepped forward, cutting him off with the kind of precision that came from years of shutting down objections. Her records were scrubbed on orders from JSOC. Joint Special Operations Command. She was ordered to disappear after a black operations extraction was classified and buried. Officially, Captain Chen does not exist. Has not existed for 2 years. The colonel turned his attention fully to Sarah. "Your call sign was Valkyrie. You held off an enemy position alone for 3 hours after your team evacuated, ensuring every wounded Marine reached the landing zone. You took fire that should have killed you twice over. You didn't go down." Another Marine stepped forward, a sergeant, older, with scars on his neck and hands. "I was in that extraction. She saved my life. Took shrapnel meant for me. Kept shooting until we were wheels up." Webb's mother was crying openly now, gripping Sarah's hand with both of hers, repeating something inaudible over and over. The general explained in the voice of someone delivering facts that would reshape everything. "Your commanding officer ordered you into civilian life to protect operational security. We lost track of you deliberately, protocol for classified personnel. Until Dr. Pierce's investigation pinged our monitoring systems 48 hours ago and brought you back on our radar." The general's aide handed him another folder. He passed it to the MP standing behind Pierce. $1.3 million in fraudulent Medicare billing. Kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives. Insurance fraud spanning 3 years. All linked to Dr. Pierce's signature. Pierce's face had gone pale, not angry pale, but the pale of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. "Those weren't, I can explain. The investigation you initiated against Captain Chen gave us cause to examine this facility's financial records," the general said, his voice like a closing door. "We found your arrangements. Your offshore accounts. Your arrangements with vendors who never delivered services. One of the MPs stepped forward and placed a hand on Pierce's elbow. Not rough, not theatrical, just a clear signal that his time in this room had ended. He tried to pull away. The MPs didn't let him. They moved him toward the door with the same precision they'd use moving a prisoner, but Pierce wasn't fighting anymore. He was just walking, deflated, his vindication turned to ash in seconds. Sarah watched him go without moving. Her hand stayed at her sides. Her expression remained unchanged, not cruel, not satisfied, just empty of judgment. The room seemed larger once he was gone. The general produced another document from the evidence bag. I have orders from the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He paused. They ask if you want your command back. Full rank, full clearance, operational status. The Helmand Province team has been held in reserve waiting for medical clearance to redeploy. They're waiting for their Valkyrie to come home. Webb's hand found Sarah's. He squeezed it once. His mother was still crying, but differently now, not from confusion or fear, but from understanding something about her son she'd never known, about the kind of people who would run toward explosions instead of away from them. Sarah's voice, when she spoke, was different than it had been in the motel or at the bus stop or in any moment of the past 2 years of erasure. It was the voice from before, from Helmand, from the nights when she'd held a defensive position alone and made decisions that saved lives. It was command voice, the kind that moved men and women without question. I want to stay here. At Seattle General. Running the Veterans Trauma Unit. Building a protocol for combat-related injuries that actually saves people instead of just processing them. The general's expression didn't change. But something in his eyes shifted, recognition, maybe respect. That's a bigger battle than holding a hill in Helmand. Yes, sir, Sarah said. It is. The staff captain folded his citation. Webb squeezed her hand again. The Marines in dress blue stood at ease, their posture relaxing slightly. Outside, rain began hammering the windows, the kind of rain that fell hard and didn't apologize, the kind that sounded like applause if you listened the right way. Sarah touched the unit patch the general was holding, her fingers tracing the dried blood, and for the first time in 48 hours, she allowed herself to breathe like someone who might actually have a future. 6 months later, Dr. Pierce taught CPR fundamentals at a San Antonio community college for minimum wage, and every night when Sarah ran her veterans trauma unit at Brooke Army Medical Center, every night when she checked on Webb, now her patient advocate, she touched the unit patch mounted in her office and remembered that some ghosts refused to stay buried. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the center of the Veterans Trauma Unit at Brooke Army Medical Center, her captain's insignia catching the fluorescent light like a small gold promise. The unit stretched across the entire East Wing, 16 beds dedicated exclusively to combat-related injuries, staffed by nurses who understood that some wounds couldn't be measured in centimeters or milliliters. Her record had been unsealed. Her name had been restored. The woman who'd spent 2 years as a ghost now wore her rank openly, and the weight of it felt less like burden and more like permission. The unit moved around her with the precise coordination of people who'd learned that hesitation kills. Every protocol Sarah had implemented came from Helmand, from nights when decisions measured in seconds meant the difference between a soldier going home and a flag folding in a mother's hands. Marcus Webb limped past the nurse's station, patient advocate clipboard in hand, his movements still careful but infinitely stronger than they'd been 6 months ago. The tension pneumothorax had healed. The surgeries had rebuilt what the IED had torn apart. But more than his lungs had been restored, Webb had been given purpose again. He'd refused discharge until Sarah agreed to let him work the unit, and now he moved between beds with the authority of someone who'd survived the absolute worst and chosen to stay. His limp was slight. His scars were visible. Every veteran who met him knew immediately that recovery was possible, that the unit director who led them had sent someone just like them back from the edge. Webb caught Sarah's eye across the unit and nodded toward her office. It was 11 at night. The night shift hummed with controlled purpose, ventilators whooshing, monitors beeping their steady electronic pulse, nurses moving with the economical grace of people who'd learned to do more with less. Sarah's office was small but deliberate. A desk with 3 monitors showing unit vitals. A cabinet with protocols organized by injury type. And on the wall behind her desk, mounted under museum glass, was the faded unit patch. The one that had been sewn inside her jacket lining in Helmand Province. The one marked with Webb's blood from the night she'd carried him 2 kilometers across hostile terrain to the landing zone. It was labeled simply, Helmand Province Extraction. 8 out. The other 7 faces from that photograph, the ones she'd been ordered to forget, were present in the patch itself. Every stitch carried their weight. Sarah's hand rose to touch the glass without thinking. Every evening before leaving, she performed this ritual. Not prayer. Not exactly. Something closer to witnessing. Webb appeared in the doorway and watched her hand linger on the glass. You could have stayed invisible, Webb said quietly. Let the investigation happen. Let Pierce burn without revealing yourself. Sarah didn't turn. You whispered my call sign. That made invisibility impossible. I remembered you, Webb continued. Even through the morphine. The way you moved. The way your hands never shook. That's not something you forget. You replaced me, Sarah said. Did the same job. Got hurt the same way. Someone had to stay in the field. Someone had to carry on. Someone had to keep healing, Webb replied. That was your job. He took that from you. I had to remind you who you actually were. The silence stretched between them like understanding. Neither of them needed to speak about Dr. Pierce anymore. 6 months had transformed him into a cautionary tale. His medical license had been suspended pending permanent revocation. The fraud charges, the $1.3 million in fraudulent billing, the pharmaceutical kickback scheme, the fabricated incident reports designed to destroy Sarah's credibility had resulted in federal charges that his attorneys were still negotiating. The easiest news to digest was the simplest. Dr. Pierce now taught CPR fundamentals at San Antonio Community College for $15 an hour, instructing civilians in chest compressions and rescue breathing, his hands no longer permitted to practice medicine. The institutional power he'd wielded, the board connections, the investigator on retainer, the ability to make a single nurse disappear, had evaporated the moment the Pentagon arrived. Sarah's phone buzzed. A message from Webb's mother, a photograph of Webb walking unassisted across a parking lot, text reading simply, "Thank you for giving me my son back." Sarah showed Webb the image without speaking. He looked away, jaw working. The night shift began at midnight. Sarah moved through the unit with Webb following, clipboard in hand, her movements still economical and precise but no longer hidden. A young Marine with fresh thermal burns watched her pass bed 4, his eyes tracking her with the intensity of someone cataloging survival. "Are you the Valkyrie?" he asked. His voice was hoarse, probably from smoke inhalation. "The one from Helmand Province? They say you were a legend." Sarah paused at the foot of his bed. "I'm Captain Chen. I'm your nurse." "Your name?" "Lance Corporal Darius Moore. Recon Marines." He swallowed carefully. "Is it true? The stories about what you did out there?" Sarah thought of Pierce in the break room, of her disciplinary write-up pinned to the bulletin board, of standing at a rain-soaked bus stop with a cardboard box containing the only evidence that her past had been real. She thought of the needle decompression at 2:56 a.m., of Webb's lips pinking up as the pressure released, of knowing in that moment that invisibility was no longer possible. She thought of her team in Helmand, 8 faces, 3 now dead, all of them ghosts she'd been ordered to forget until a young medic whispered her call sign and made forgetting impossible. "Legends are just people who did their job when it mattered," Sarah said. "That's all I did. That's all any of us do." She checked Moore's vitals. Oxygen saturation good. Pain management adequate. Thermal injury depth and extent documented. She made 3 notes on his chart and moved to the next bed. Webb followed, the rhythm between them now practiced, his documentation mirroring her assessment, his understanding of each patient's trajectory informing her decisions. They'd built something together. Not just a unit. A sanctuary for the kind of healing that required someone to have already survived the worst. The hours moved like they always did in trauma care, minutes stretching into eternities. Then suddenly it was 0400 hours and the unit had cycled through admissions, discharges, and the quiet moments where stability felt like victory. Sarah stopped at the nurse's station where her name was printed on the schedule, Captain Sarah Chen, Unit Director. No more ghost. No more invisible. No more eating lunch alone while others gathered their coffee cups and left the break room. The structure of her days had shifted from erasure to visibility, and she discovered something unexpected, that being known was harder than being hidden, but infinitely more worth the cost. A newer nurse, fresh from her trauma certification, approached with a question about wound debridement protocols. Sarah answered in the clear, authoritative voice that had emerged over the past months, no longer deferential, no longer careful to take up less space. The voice of someone who'd trained in the harshest conditions and chosen to share that knowledge rather than hoard it. The nurse listened, implemented the protocol, and the patient's recovery accelerated accordingly. This was the real victory. Not Pierce's fall, though that had been necessary. Not Sarah's restoration, though that had been deserved. The victory was this, a system where invisible heroes could become visible, where the people who'd survived combat could lead the healing of others, where a Marine with thermal burns could believe that recovery was possible because his unit director had been rebuilt from something worse. At 0530 hours, as the night shift wound toward morning handoff, Webb walked Sarah to the parking lot. The San Antonio dawn was beginning to shade the sky purple at the edges. They stood without speaking, two people who understood that the most profound conversations often required no words. Sarah had been given back her identity, her rank, her future. Webb had been given back his life. And together they'd built something that hadn't existed before, a unit where the invisible became visible, where ghosts refused to stay buried, where the ones who had seen the worst were the ones who gave the most. "You're mentoring the next rotation," Webb said. 6 new nurses starting Monday. "I know," Sarah replied. "Combat trauma is becoming a specialty. Other hospitals are asking for protocols based on what we've built here. You could write a book," Webb offered. "Teach at the medical schools. Retire into academia." Sarah watched the sky continue its color transformation, purple deepening to pink. "I'm not done nursing," she said. "The day I stop seeing patients is the day I stop understanding why the protocols matter. Besides, someone needs to make sure that invisible heroes don't stay invisible. That's not a book project. That's a mission." Webb smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who'd watched his nurse perform a needle decompression in the dark, who'd heard her whisper his call sign into his ear as she carried him toward the landing zone, who'd understood in the moment that he was being saved by someone who'd already sacrificed everything to keep others alive. "Then I'll keep walking beside you," he said simply. "That's what patient advocates do." Sarah drove home as the sun broke across the horizon, painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold. The trauma unit would continue without her until the evening shift arrived. The patients would be monitored by excellent nurses who understood that some wounds required more than medical knowledge, they required witness survival. Dr. Pierce would continue teaching CPR to civilians who would never know what he'd tried to do, would never understand the institutional power he'd wielded until the Pentagon called and erased it entirely. And Sarah would return tonight and the night after, moving through the unit with the kind of competence that only comes from having been tested in the worst possible circumstances and having chosen, afterward, to heal. If you've ever felt invisible at work, if you've ever done the job that mattered while the institution tried to erase you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below with a time you were underestimated and proved everyone wrong. And share this with someone you know who refuses to stay buried. Because the ones who have seen the worst often give the most.